At approximately 5 p.m. on March 31st, 2015, the everyday tranquility of the Albian neighborhood in Australia was suddenly shattered by desperate cries for help emanating from a house. It was a woman's voice, and the sound of desperation alarmed nearby residents, who rushed over to see what was happening. When they arrived, they determined the cries for help were coming from the backyard of the house. However, when they tried to approach, they discovered the gate leading to the backyard was locked tight, with no way to get inside. In that situation, only a neighbor living right next door, thanks to their advantageous position from the upper floor of their home, could observe what was happening on the other side of the wall. The neighbor witnessed an Asian woman holding a large pair of garden shears, frantically attacking another Asian woman. The attack was swift and brutal. Within moments, the woman being attacked had collapsed to the ground and lay motionless. Witnessing this scene, the neighbor quickly pulled out their phone to record the entire incident while immediately calling the police. As soon as they received the report of a homicide, police were immediately dispatched to the scene. Upon arrival, finding the front door closed with no one answering, they decided to force entry. The scene inside the house made the officers freeze for a moment. In the living room, an Asian woman sat on the sofa with a strangely calm demeanor. On the floor, an Asian man lay helpless, his hands and feet bound tightly, his mouth sealed with tape. Fortunately, the man was still alive. Police immediately restrained the woman while quickly untying and removing the tape from the man on the floor. As soon as he was freed, the man appeared extremely panicked and agitated. He paid no attention to his own condition, only desperately pleading with police to quickly check the bedroom inside to see if his grandson was safe. When the officers entered the room, he indicated they discovered a 4-year-old boy lying on the bed with no signs of life. The tragedy didn't end there. When police proceeded to check the backyard area, they found the body of another woman who had also died. The forensic team was summoned to the scene immediately afterward to conduct autopsies. After thorough examination, they confirmed both victims had died from multiple stab wounds inflicted by a sharp object. From the surviving man's testimony, police gradually pieced together a complete picture of the complex relationships between those involved in the case. According to his account, the two unfortunate victims were his wife and grandson. The woman arrested by police, who had been sitting calmly on the sofa, was his mistress, and also the perpetrator who had committed this horrific crime. This was not a random killing or an impulsive act in a moment of anger, but rather a meticulously calculated act of revenge, so brutal it made people shudder. The woman had deliberately targeted the people he loved most to punish him. Looking back at the entire chain of events leading to this bloody tragedy, it can be said that the root cause of everything stemmed from this man meeting someone he never should have met. To better understand the context of this story, we need to know that Australia has long been known as a promised land for workers from around the world. The country's per capita income is a figure that citizens of many developing nations can only dream of. For this reason, those doing manual labor jobs back home with meager wages often believe that going to Australia to work would be a much better choice, an opportunity to change their lives and escape poverty. However, reality is far from the rosy picture they imagine. Going to Australia to work and settle is not simple at all. That path is filled with difficulties, challenges, and traps that not everyone can overcome. In May 2011, a woman from Guangxi named Wan Ai-hua, who had been fortunate enough to obtain permanent residency in Australia, decided to return home to visit relatives and friends after many years away. During this trip home, she happened to reconnect with a fellow countrywoman named Liao Kaixia. Kaixia was 42 years old that year, and her life had just gone through a major upheaval when her marriage fell apart. Her son, who was of school age and currently attending middle school, had been awarded to her ex-husband's custody by the court. Although she no longer had the burden of raising her child, being separated from her son still made Kaixia feel sad. In Guangxi, she ran a small retail business, earning just enough to live on and save a little money. However, such a life still made her feel dull and lacking in prospects for the future. When she met Ai-hua again, Kaixia heard about her life in Australia. Through Aihua's stories, life in Australia appeared beautiful and comfortable, full of amenities and opportunities. The tales of high income, good living conditions, and an open future filled Kaichia with admiration and longing. She began to develop the idea of going to Australia to build a career and find a better life. Kaichia boldly shared this thought with Aihua. After hearing it, Aihua was very enthusiastic. She not only supported Kaichia's decision, but also carefully guided her on how to get to Australia. Aihua even promised that when Kaichia arrived in Australia, she would do everything she could to help her settle and stabilize her life in this new land. With determination to change her life, in the fall of 2011, Kaichia found an immigration agency to help handle the necessary procedures. However, given her circumstances and conditions, the only path available to her was to apply for a tourist visa, which was only valid for a mere 3 months. Despite knowing time was short, Kaichia decided to take a chance, thinking she would go there first and figure things out later. So she left Guangxi and took the long flight to Melbourne, full of expectations and dreams of a brighter new life. However, harsh reality quickly poured cold water on Kaichia's rosy illusions. When she arrived in Melbourne, she learned that Aihua had obtained her permanent residency in Australia by marrying a disabled Aboriginal Australian man. Aihua herself didn't have any stable job and was unemployed at home all day. The couple's life completely depended on meager government welfare payments, struggling and lacking in every way, nothing like the prosperous, enviable life she had boasted about. Nevertheless, despite her own less than comfortable life, Aihua kept her promise to help Kaichia. She introduced Kaichia to a dishwashing job at a Chinese restaurant in Melbourne. After helping Kaichia find work, the connection between them gradually became sparse, and they no longer kept in touch as much as before. Before Kaichia left for Melbourne, the immigration agency had promised her that they would find a way to extend her visa when the 3-month tourist visa expired. That was one of the important reasons Kaichia felt confident paying them a considerable sum to handle all the procedures. She trusted that with support from a professional agency, staying in Australia long-term wouldn't be too difficult a problem. But when the 3 months were passing and Kaichia contacted the agency again, she received a major shock. The agency nonchalantly denied all previous commitments, saying they had never promised such a thing and claimed they had no ability to process a visa extension for her. The promises from before were now completely denied, with no one taking responsibility. Kaichia felt utterly disappointed and helpless in this difficult situation. She had only been working for about a month, and the money she'd earned wasn't even enough to cover the expensive plane ticket and rent for those first days in Australia. If she had to return home empty-handed now, wouldn't all the effort, money, and expectations she had invested in this trip be for nothing? Thinking about it, Kaichia couldn't accept this harsh reality. But the problem didn't stop at visa extension. There was an even more worrying truth that Kaichia had to face every day. According to Australian law, people holding tourist visas are absolutely forbidden from doing any paid work on Australian territory. Her dishwashing job at the Chinese restaurant was actually illegal work, a serious violation of immigration law. If discovered by authorities, she would immediately be arrested and deported, and might even be banned from entering Australia for many years afterward. For this reason, every workday for Kaichia was a day living in anxiety and fear. Amid those months of constant stress and anxiety, a person Kaichia considered her savior unexpectedly appeared in her life. This man was named Brian Mach, 58 years old that year, exactly 16 years older than Kaichia. Brian was of Chinese descent and had long been settled and living in Australia. Previously, he had spent time working at factories in China, which was why he could understand Chinese quite well. At the time Brian met Kaichia, he and his wife were separated, each living in different places though they hadn't officially divorced. Brian's wife was named Mai Mach, a Vietnamese immigrant woman just 1 year younger than her husband. They had a daughter together. This daughter was now grown, had her own family, and had recently given birth to a son. Because Brian's ancestors were Chinese, despite having lived in Australia for so many years, he still maintained a special love for Chinese cuisine. He frequently visited Chinese restaurants in the city alone to enjoy the familiar dishes that reminded him of his roots. It was during these visits that Brian met and got to know Keixia, the woman working as a dishwasher at the restaurant. During slow times or when Keixia got a brief break, she would often come out to chat a few words with this regular customer. Gradually, through those brief but frequent conversations, the two became closer and more familiar with each other. Meanwhile, Keixia's visa was running out day by day, and the fear of having to return home empty-handed made her desperately want to find someone who could help her stay in this land. With that thought driving her, Keixia began to plan her approach to Brian deliberately. For several days afterward, she intentionally went to the supermarket near Brian's house to shop, even though she had no urgent need. The real purpose of these trips was to create an opportunity to coincidentally run into the man she was targeting. Keixia waited patiently, day after day, hoping that sooner or later fate would arrange a meeting for them. And indeed, persistence paid off. Finally, one late afternoon, Keixia and Brian happened to meet at the supermarket just as she had hoped. After they both finished paying for their items, they walked out of the supermarket together and strolled along the same path. During that short walk, Keixia realized this was the golden opportunity she had been waiting for. She cleverly expressed her admiration and special affection for Brian, her sweet words mixed with calculated shyness. She didn't stop at words. Keixia deliberately created physical contact that seemed accidental, but was actually intentional. Brian, a man in his twilight years who was separated from his wife, looking at this woman so much younger than himself who was showing such interest and admiration, his heart began to stir. Feelings he thought had long been dormant were suddenly awakened, and he developed reciprocal feelings for this woman. From that fateful afternoon, the relationship between them entered a new chapter, filled with romantic ambiguity. They began calling each other every day, conversations lasting hours. However, this romantic ambiguity didn't last long before quickly crossing the line. The two officially became adulterers. One weekend afternoon, Brian came to Keixia's place. In that small room, they were intimate for the first time. For Brian at that moment, Keixia was the most attractive and alluring woman he had ever met in his life. By her side, he felt as if he had been reborn, finding the vitality and excitement he thought he had lost long ago. After several intimate encounters as their relationship grew deeper, Keixia decided it was time to bring up the most important issue weighing on her heart. During one private conversation, she sadly told Brian that her tourist visa was about to expire, and by regulation, she would have to leave Australia and return to China. However, Keixia quickly offered a solution. If Brian agreed to sponsor her and send her a visitor invitation letter, she would have legal grounds to apply for a new visa and return to Melbourne to continue being with him. If Brian didn't help, this would probably be the last time they would see each other. After she returned home, they would be forever separated. Hearing these words, Brian couldn't help but fall into deep thought. Doubts began to form in his mind. Did this woman truly love him? Or was she just using him as a stepping stone, a tool to achieve her goal of staying in Australia? To test Keixia's feelings, Brian decided to ask a probing question. If I don't send you the invitation letter, will you hate me? Keixia heard this and showed no sign of embarrassment or confusion. She looked straight into Brian's eyes and answered with a voice full of sincerity. Whether I can stay in Australia or not doesn't matter at all to me. What matters most is being by your side. As long as I have you, I'm happy anywhere. If you want, we could even go to China together. These words from Keixia moved Brian deeply. He believed this woman's feelings for him were genuine. With emotion in his heart, Brian gently told Keixia, "Go ahead and return, then wait with peace of mind. My invitation letter will definitely come. When I make a promise, I keep it." According to relevant regulations of the Australian Immigration Department, any citizen possessing Australian citizenship or permanent residency, provided they have sufficient financial ability to act as sponsor, can send visitor invitation letters to family members or friends with whom they have a relationship. And Brian, as a legal Australian citizen, was fully qualified to do this for Keixia. In winter 2011, Keixia returned to her hometown in Guangxi when her tourist visa expired. Just a short time after arriving home, She was overjoyed to receive the official visitor invitation letter from Brian, exactly as he had promised. With this letter in hand, the door to returning to Australia was wide open before Kaichia. She excitedly boasted to all her relatives and friends that she had found a wealthy and generous boyfriend in Australia. She told them that thanks to his dedicated help, she could now freely enter and exit Australia any time without worrying about visa issues like before. Not only that, Kaichia also happily let everyone know that this boyfriend had promised to help her with the necessary procedures to bring her son to Australia to study, opening up a bright future. In spring 2012, Kaichia once again came to Melbourne as a visitor. This time, her visa was valid for longer, up to 6 months, allowing her more time to be with Brian and build their relationship. Brian was very attentive and caring toward his lover. He used his connections to find Kaichia a new job, much easier and more comfortable than her previous exhausting dishwashing work. Moreover, whenever Kaichia faced financial difficulties and was short on money, Brian was willing to help without hesitation or calculation. The peak of sweetness in this relationship came when Brian gave Kaichia a ring, along with a firm promise that he would marry her. Kaichia was overjoyed at this proposal. She was so happy that she couldn't keep the good news to herself, excitedly introducing Brian to all the friends she knew in Melbourne, proudly showing off the man she was about to marry. But life doesn't always go according to expectations. Everything began to change when Brian's daughter decided to send her young son, just 1 or 2 years old, to stay with his grandparents. The appearance of this little grandson in the house awakened family feelings in Brian that he thought had grown cold. Brian began staying home more to care for his grandson, instead of spending time outside with Kaichia as before. Every day he watched his wife Mai diligently wake up early, leave home at 6 a.m. to go to work, then not return until 5 p.m. after a hard day's labor. He looked at his grown daughter and his adorable grandson. All these images gradually made Brian develop the idea of returning to his family, abandoning the idea of separation from the wife who had been with him for so many years. However, despite this change of heart, Brian continued to maintain his extramarital relationship with Kaichia. Time passed, but Kaichia noticed that Brian still showed no sign of proceeding with divorce from his wife, as he had promised. The endless waiting made Kaichia begin to doubt. She wondered whether Brian was lying to her, whether all those sweet promises were just tricks to keep her by his side. Unable to continue enduring this ambiguity, Kaichia decided to confront the issue directly. She frankly asked Brian to quickly complete the divorce process so they could officially be together. Faced with this direct request, Brian had no way to avoid it. He began explaining to Kaichia about the difficulties and obstacles in divorcing. According to him, Australian law placed great emphasis on protecting the rights of women and children in divorce cases. If he decided to divorce, by regulation, he would have to give at least half of all accumulated assets to his wife. Not only that, but the pension he would receive in old age would also be seriously affected. Brian lamented that he was already 59 years old, soon to lose his ability to work and earn money. If he divorced at this point, with assets split in half and pension reduced, his old age would certainly be difficult and miserable. After hearing these explanations, Kaichia tried to reassure and convince Brian. She gently said, "After you divorce, we'll marry each other. Then I'll be by your side taking care of you thoroughly, looking after your every meal and sleep. With me beside you, why would you have to worry about a miserable old age?" However, Brian shook his head and replied doubtfully, "You're still so young, with a long future ahead, while I'm already old. Moreover, we haven't known each other or been together very long. I'm afraid that later, as time passes, when you realize the age gap between us, you'll inevitably regret choosing to be with a man like me." Faced with Brian's concerns, Kaichia fervently swore and vowed. She firmly declared that her love for him was eternal, that she would forever stay by his side no matter what happened, never leaving or regretting. But no matter what Kaichia said, no matter how earnestly she swore, Brian no longer mentioned his marriage promise. Kaichia was no fool. She could clearly see the true thoughts hidden behind Brian's polite refusals. He no longer wanted to divorce his wife, and the marriage promise from before was now just a distant memory he had no intention of fulfilling. Realizing this harsh truth, Kaikia felt utterly disappointed and dejected. The hopes she had nurtured all this time suddenly vanished like smoke. To find a way to escape the negative emotions tormenting her every day, Kaikia began turning to drugs as a release, a temporary escape from her painful reality. However, no matter how disappointed she was, Kaikia still wouldn't give up her determination to immigrate to Australia. Because in phone calls home to her son in Guangxi, she had repeatedly promised firmly that she would bring him to Australia to study and have a brighter future. The promise to her son was the strongest motivation driving her to stay in this land at any cost. Seeing that Brian refused to leave his family to truly marry her, Kaikia had to think of another plan. She proposed to Brian the idea of a sham marriage. According to her plan, they only needed to register their marriage officially on paper, while in reality, Brian's life wouldn't be affected at all. He could continue living with his wife and family as normal, only needing to be Kaikia's husband legally on paper to help her obtain legal residency in Australia. But Brian shook his head and refused this proposal. He seriously told Kaikia, "Australia isn't a paradise for ordinary people like you think. Life here isn't easy at all. If you don't have any professional skills or qualifications, even if you get a green card, you'll have to do manual labor your whole life. Are you mentally prepared for such a life?" He continued explaining the legal risks of a sham marriage. Furthermore, throughout the time after registering the marriage, the Australian Immigration Department will conduct very strict checks and monitoring of our relationship. They'll interview each person separately, check the residence, question neighbors, and use many other methods to verify the authenticity of the marriage. Once they discover it's a fake marriage, the consequences will be extremely serious. You'll immediately be deported to China and banned from Australia forever, never having another chance to set foot here. As for me, I'll face enormous fines, and might even be criminally prosecuted and imprisoned. Through these lengthy but clear explanations, Brian's true intentions were fully revealed. He didn't want to take risks, didn't want to implicate himself in this sham marriage with Kaikia. Whether it was a real marriage or a fake one, his answer was no. Despite being refused by Brian regarding marriage, Kaikia still wouldn't give up her goal of staying in Australia at any cost. On one hand, she continued maintaining her mistress relationship with Brian. Though this relationship no longer had prospects leading to marriage, at least it was still a thread keeping Kaikia's opportunity to set foot in the land she longed for. On the other hand, she secretly searched for other opportunities, other men who could help her achieve her ultimate goal of obtaining permanent residency in Australia. During this search, Kaikia met and contacted several Australian men who indicated they were willing to participate in a sham marriage with her in exchange for money. However, after being deceived by the immigration agency before, Kaikia had become much more cautious. She feared she would be scammed again, losing money without gaining anything. Therefore, despite contacting many people, she still didn't dare risk proceeding with any marriage transaction with them. In fall 2014, through the introduction of a fellow countrywoman also living in Melbourne, Kaikia had the opportunity to meet a man named Stephen, 52 years old that year. At the first meeting, Stephen was quite open and honest when introducing himself. He said that he had previously worked in trade and had lived and worked in China for 5 years. Thanks to that time, he had learned Chinese and could communicate basically with Chinese people without too much difficulty. Stephen also frankly admitted he wasn't a wealthy man. In recent years, he had only worked as a tour guide to make ends meet, with income just enough to cover living expenses. Regarding his marital status, Stephen said he was currently in the process of divorcing his current wife. He expressed his hope that after completing the divorce, he could find a gentle Chinese wife who would care for the family. From that first meeting, Kaikia felt this man was very honest and sincere, unlike the scammers she had heard about or feared meeting. Moreover, in appearance, Stephen looked quite refined and polite, with a calm demeanor, not appearing to be a bad person. With these initial positive impressions, Kaikia decided to exchange contact information with Stephen so they could continue keeping in touch and getting to know each other better. Sometime later, Stephen proactively contacted her and invited Kaixia to dinner. During that meal, when the atmosphere had become more intimate and comfortable, Stephen began discussing the main matter. He said his divorce proceedings with his wife were progressing well and nearly complete. However, there was a difficult problem he was facing. According to Australian law regarding property division and divorce, he was required to give half the value of his real estate to his soon-to-be ex-wife. His house, after appraisal, was worth about 3 million RMB, approximately 420,000 US dollars, meaning he would have to compensate his wife about 1.5 million RMB, approximately 210,000 US dollars, to keep the house. Stephen said that if she could help him pay this compensation, he would marry her, helping her obtain legal residency in Australia. After hearing the proposal, Kaixia calculated in her head, then honestly replied that she didn't have 1.5 million RMB as Stephen requested. Her financial capability at most could only come up with about 700,000 RMB, approximately 100,000 US dollars. Stephen heard this, thought for a moment, then said 700,000 would be fine. When her visitor visa expired and she had to return to Guangxi, she no longer felt the heavy despair of previous times. This time, she left with great hope of soon returning to Australia with a completely different status, no longer a temporary visitor, but the legal wife of an Australian citizen. As soon as she got home, Kaixia began running around everywhere to borrow money. She didn't reveal the true purpose of the loan, only saying she needed money to invest in business abroad. Throughout the time Kaixia was in Guangxi arranging the money, Stephen kept in regular contact with her from across the ocean. He frequently called to ask after her warmly, caring about her health and daily life. Occasionally, he proactively updated Kaixia about his divorce progress, reporting that everything was going smoothly and was nearly complete. Stephen also showed thoughtfulness by reminding Kaixia to prepare the necessary documents for marrying a foreigner, including birth certificate and criminal background check. To be more certain, Kaixia asked people with experience and was confirmed that to register marriage with a foreign citizen, these documents were mandatory. This made her even more confident that Stephen was seriously intending to marry her and wasn't just talking. In December 2014, when Kaixia had gathered enough money, she took a flight back to Melbourne. At the airport, Stephen had arrived early to pick her up. He arranged for her to stay at a hotel in suburban Melbourne, where they would live together while waiting to complete the procedures. Throughout the 7 days together in the hotel, Kaixia carefully observed every word and action from Stephen. He behaved politely, warmly, and reliably, with no suspicious behavior to cause her concern. With almost absolute trust at that point, Kaixia transferred the entire 700,000 RMB, approximately 100,000 USD, to Stephen's bank account. When the transaction was complete, Stephen embraced her with a grateful expression, making Kaixia even more assured that she had made the right decision. But this joy didn't last long. Early the next morning, when Kaixia woke up, she was stunned to realize that Stephen had disappeared without a trace. His personal belongings were no longer in the room, no note left, no message to explain. She hurriedly called, but the other end only had a steady dial tone. No one answered. She called back dozens of times with the same result. Like a bolt from the blue, Kaixia realized a truth so harsh it was cruel. She had been scammed. The entire 700,000 RMB, approximately 100,000 USD, that she had painstakingly borrowed from so many relatives and friends, the money she had bet her entire future on, had now fallen into the hands of a con artist. In panic and despair, Kaixia immediately ran to the police station to report the incident. However, when police began investigating, they quickly hit a dead end. The only information Kaixia could provide about Stephen was a mobile phone number, and that number was now unreachable. With such scant leads, tracking Stephen was virtually impossible. But the more difficult problem was that Kaixia couldn't tell the police the true purpose of the money transfer. She couldn't admit that she had given Stephen 700,000 RMB, approximately 100,000 USD, in exchange for a sham marriage. Therefore, in the eyes of the police, This was simply a financial transaction between two adults with full judgment capacity and civil behavior. Kaikshia had voluntarily transferred money to a man she knew, with no evidence of coercion or threats. Most importantly, she couldn't prove that Stephen had committed fraud as defined by law. For these reasons, police refused to open a case for investigation. Unwilling to accept losing such a huge sum of money, Kaikshia decided to seek Australian lawyers for consultation and find a legal path to recover her money. However, the lawyer told her directly that the nature of her actions involved an attempt at unjust enrichment. She wanted to obtain residency rights through a sham marriage that she wasn't qualified for. This violated Australian law, and no Australian authority would protect or support such behavior. Realizing the 700,000 RMB, approximately 100,000 USD, was lost with no hope of recovery, Kaikshia fell into a state of both anger and unwillingness to accept it. She resented Stephen, who had deceived her so cunningly and blatantly. She resented herself for placing complete trust in a stranger after just a few meetings. Now she was not only empty-handed but also carrying an enormous debt. Kaikshia's situation at this point had hit rock bottom with nothing left to lose. In that extreme desperation, Kaikshia realized that Brian was her last straw, the only lifeline she could still cling to. Though he had refused her many times, though the relationship between them had grown cold, Brian was still the only person capable of helping her escape her current predicament. With this thought, Kaikshia began constantly appearing at Brian's house. She begged, pleaded, even implored him to agree to divorce and marry her. To convince Brian, Kaikshia said that after they married, she would absolutely not interfere with Brian continuing to meet and interact with Mai. Even if Brian no longer wanted to maintain a real spousal relationship with her afterward, she wouldn't utter a word of complaint or demand anything more. She only needed the title of husband and wife on paper, so she could legally stay in Australia. But no matter what Kaikshia said, Brian firmly refused. Seeing the first approach fail, Kaikshia proposed another option. She told Brian they could just register the marriage on paper, without needing to live together or have any other commitments. The only thing she wanted was for Brian to help her bring her son to Australia to study. Kaikshia desperately said that even if she herself were discovered and deported later, she would forever remember Brian's kindness, never forgetting. In Kaikshia's view, she had made the maximum possible concession, lowered her demands to the lowest level. But Brian still refused. He clearly understood that whether it was a real marriage or just a sham on paper, once he got involved in this, his currently peaceful life would certainly suffer unpredictable adverse effects. Kaikshia's constant appearances at Brian's house couldn't be hidden forever. Mai, Brian's wife, gradually noticed something unusual was happening. One late night, Mai happened to look out the bedroom window and witnessed a strange scene. Under the dim yellow streetlight in the neighborhood, a woman's silhouette stood motionless, eyes staring fixedly toward their house. The sight made Mai feel uneasy and disturbed. She turned to ask Brian what was happening, why a strange woman was standing staring at their house in the middle of the night like that. Faced with his wife's unexpected question, Brian appeared extremely flustered and unnatural. He stammered out some words to explain superficially. But Mai wasn't someone easily fooled. After so many years living together, she understood her husband's personality and every expression well. Just looking at Brian's confused face and evasive attitude, Mai immediately realized that the relationship between her husband and that woman was certainly not as simple as he wanted her to believe. Pain of betrayal invaded her soul. Mai silently turned away, buried her face in the pillow, and sobbed uncontrollably. Seeing his wife cry, Brian hurried to her side to comfort her, stroking her and promising that no matter what woman loved him, he would never be tempted. However, Brian's promise was soon proven false. One day, Mai got off work earlier than usual. When she walked into the house and went to the backyard, the scene before her eyes made her freeze. Kaikshia was there, right in her backyard, blatantly seducing Brian. Not only that, but Kaikshia had boldly stepped forward to kiss Brian right before her eyes, and Brian showed no sign of resistance or pushing her away. Witnessing this heartbreaking scene, Mai tried to control the rage and pain boiling inside her. She quickly pulled out her phone and captured evidence of her husband's infidelity. Only after securing the evidence did Mai explode in fury. She shouted loudly and immediately chased Katia out of the house. After Katia had left, Mai turned to face Brian, her voice cold but full of bitterness. She told her husband directly that if he wanted to divorce to be with that woman, she wouldn't hold on or try to keep him. Hearing those words, Brian became truly panicked. He hurriedly apologized and tried every possible way to soothe his wife's anger. This time, Brian had truly decided that he must completely cut off all relations with Katia. When he met Katia again, he demanded she never mention marriage again. It would never happen. Brian also warned sternly, if Katia wouldn't stop and continued to harass him, he would stop sending her visitor invitation letters, meaning she would lose her last chance to legally return to Australia. However, Katia was too determined about her goal of staying in Australia at any cost. She wasn't fazed by Brian's warnings, continuing to cling to and harass him, demanding he marry her. On February 27th, 2015, just 4 days before the horrific tragedy occurred, Brian, after so many patient refusals and warnings with no result, finally lost all composure. He angrily declared he would completely sever all relations with Katia, and from then on they would have nothing more to do with each other. If she continued to harass him even one more time, he wouldn't hesitate to report to the immigration department that she had been working illegally in Australia for all these years. This meant Katia would be arrested, deported, and banned from Australia forever. Hearing these words from Brian's mouth, a fire of evil fury began blazing fiercely in Katia's heart. She thought about the past 3 years, 3 years of being lovers with Brian. She remembered the sweet promises he had whispered in her ear, promises to marry her, to give her a happy life with him. She had trusted him, hoped in him, considered him the only salvation of her life. But now, after everything that had happened, she was discarded like a worn-out slipper with no value. Brian was ready to push her into the abyss without the slightest pity. This rage and resentment, Katia truly couldn't swallow it. On March 29th, just 2 days before the incident, Katia came to Brian's house again. This time, she once more proposed the sham marriage plan, even offering to pay Brian a sum of money to compensate for any trouble he might face. But Brian didn't hesitate and bluntly refused immediately. He said that from the very beginning, he had never actually thought of marrying her. Sending her visitor invitation letters over the years was merely because of lingering affection, not because of any love. Now he no longer had any feelings for her, and even less would he marry her. No to a sham marriage. No even with money. Hearing these cold and cruel words, Katia could no longer hold back. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed uncontrollably right there. All her hopes had completely collapsed. And it was precisely in that moment of ultimate despair that a dark thought began forming in her mind. If she couldn't have what she wanted, then she would drag everyone down with her. On March 31st, after Mai left the house for work, she knocked on Brian's door. When Brian saw Katia, he shouted, "Haven't we said everything that needed to be said? What exactly do you want?" Katia said she wanted to see Brian one last time, as a farewell. Brian let Katia into the house and poured her a cup of tea. They sat on the sofa talking. Meanwhile, Brian got up to check on his still sleeping grandson. Katia seized the opportunity to put drugs in Brian's tea. After Brian drank the drugged tea, he fell unconscious. Katia tied Brian up and sealed his mouth with tape. After dealing with Brian, Katia went to the backyard, picked up a pair of garden shears, and returned inside, heading toward the room where Brian's grandson slept. When Brian woke up later and saw blood on the shears, he was terrified but couldn't speak. Katia repeatedly kicked Brian, then sat on the sofa beside him, waiting for Brian's wife, Mai. Katia said, "I'm gonna kill everyone you love to make you suffer. If I'm in a good mood, maybe I'll let you go with them." Around 5 p.m., Mai returned home from work. When she walked into her own backyard, Katia charged at her with the shears. Mai screamed for help loudly but couldn't escape Katia's attack. Her cries for help were heard by nearby neighbors. The neighbors quickly called the police. Brian heard his wife's screams from inside the house, but he was helpless, only able to shed tears of regret. Katia came inside holding the shears and told Brian his wife was dead. She said she would wait until his daughter came to pick up the child, then kill his daughter too. However, Kaixia didn't get to wait for Brian's daughter. Instead, the police arrived. Through investigation, police learned that Kaixia had been married twice in China. Her first husband died in a car accident. From then on, Kaixia's mental health began having problems. But because in China, especially in small places, having mental illness is often seen as a shameful thing, she had never sought treatment. During the conflict with Brian, her mental problems were further triggered. Kaixia felt extreme pain inside and often used drugs to relieve her emotions. But none of this affected her basic judgment capacity. Her act of revenge was terrifying and brutal, belonging to the most serious category of murder cases, and Kaixia admitted to all her crimes. Finally, on December 17, 2015, the Supreme Court of Victoria sentenced Liao Kaixia to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 32 years before she could apply for parole. Though the trial ended, Brian's life could never return to what it was before, because his infidelity had brought disaster to his family. This heartbreaking case leaves many profound lessons for all of us. Brian had a complete family, but he didn't know how to cherish what he had, instead seeking novelty outside. He made promises he never intended to keep, planting false hopes in another woman's heart only to cruelly crush them. His infidelity was the spark that led to the tragedy. As for Kaixia, her desperate desire to change her life and immigrate at any cost made her lose her reason, willing to dive into an illicit relationship with a married man. When things didn't go as she wanted, instead of accepting reality and finding another path, she let hatred and despair lead her to an unforgivable, brutal act. And that is today's case. What do you think about this case? Please share in the comments below. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.